This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and I'm joined as always by Richard.
Good to be with you again, Sam.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Richard. You've had some appliance troubles this week, and we're screeching in here trying to record a podcast.
I had a dishwasher that overflowed over my hardwood floor and soaked down into my office down in the basement and through the tiles, and just it never happens at a good time.
No, I find that catastrophe never strikes when you're prepared for it, and that's frustrating.
We may need to do a podcast on the joy of the Lord in all seasons or something soon here.
Yeah. Just get it off your chest, there, Richard. You'll feel better.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, this week, I want to do something a little bit different. We've spoken on this podcast quite often about books. We even have a recurring segment on book reviews that we do. Mm-hmm. You write book reviews, richardblackaby.com, that we've pointed people to, and every time we do a biography on a world leader, it's always coming from a book. And you are a huge proponent of books. You read voraciously, I would say, and so I want to talk about reading, and not just why you should read, but perhaps what are your strategies for reading. And so let's start, though, with why do you think it's important as a leader to be a reader?
Well, leaders back in the day, in, say, Middle Ages or earlier, if you were a leader, you had to be good at riding a horse and wielding a sword, and you needed a lot of the physical stuff. But that was all important. But of course, things have changed a bit now. You don't necessarily have to be able to cut someone's head off to be a good leader, but you've always, you've always had to be able to think, and there is such a thing as thought leadership. And where you're addressing a problem, and you're looking at it, you're thinking about it, and you're coming up with solutions. And so to be able to use your brain, to be able to think and think toward the future. Some people are just kind of worker bees. Like they don't want to think about the future. They don't want to solve a problem. They just tell me what you want me to do. And let me put in my time, and I'll go home. And that's fine if that's your vision for your life. But the leader is expected to do more. They've got to think ahead. They got to think not just about what works today, but what will be effective tomorrow, and where are we headed? Are we headed in the right direction? And a lot of issues. And so you've got to be filling your brain with stuff. We don't really create out of a void.
Right.
We create using the pieces that we've accumulated. Whether so if you're an artist, a writer, whatever you are, you're pulling from everything that you've learned and seen. And that's why they say if you're a writer, you need to travel, you need to have diverse experiences, you need to be exposed to different ideas. And I think the same is true for leadership. Whenever you face a new problem in your organization, you've got to be pulling, so what have I seen, what have I heard, what are the different approaches to problem solving that I'm aware of? And so, that comes a lot from reading. Certainly you can go to seminars, you can watch YouTube now and other things as well. But reading puts you around the greatest minds in history. And so you can read from Alexander the Great, from Caesar, from the Duke of Wellington, or whoever you want, and especially those who thought and put their thoughts down on paper. Now you get next to those people as well. And so as a leader, when I was a pastor, I loved just to read about the thoughts of other great pastors who had come into a city and maybe taken a struggling church, and then they just trusted God. They took some steps, and all of a sudden their church is the most exciting church in the whole city. Or they turned a business around. And I love just reading, and not that you're going to copy everything they did, but you can learn so much of how other people faced problems and they turned things around or saw the possibilities. And so that's why I think leaders need to read, because they're filling their mind with tools and bits and pieces that they can formulate into solutions for their own organization. And so if you only know so much and you're not adding anything to what you know, then as life gets more complex, the world has new problems you've never faced before, you've just got the same material to keep coming up with new answers all the time.
Right.
And so I feel like you just have to keep on thinking and growing. And if you're not growing, it's really hard for your organization to grow. And so reading means you're growing. You're adding constantly to your repertoire and resources. And so you owe it to your people and your organization to read and to grow.
Yeah, no, and I would agree. So we see the importance of reading. I think I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I think most people would say, yeah, it's important to read. A lot of people don't make it a priority. But so when you do read, though, from your experience, how do you read? And read in a way that you come away with something, and it's not just a check, check in the box of, okay, I read that book. Oh, I read that book.
Yeah.
But you comprehend, you think critically about it. What are some of the tools, the techniques that you employ to make sure that you're actually getting something out of what you're reading, and not just sort of, okay, yeah, it's on the shelf and I can say that I've read that latest book or whatever? Like, are you taking notes? Are you writing in the margins? I mean, we've mentioned that you do write reviews, but what are some other things that you do to make sure that you're actually grasping what's being read?
Well, several things, Sam, to say about that. One is I am a bit old school. I just put that up there, full disclosure. I have an iPad. I could read digital books more than I do. And so I would say there's maybe three primary ways that you're going to tackle a book today. One is you just get the old-fashioned paper book.
Yeah.
And open the pages and start reading. And I'll just tell you, that's still my preference. And I just have the luxury of a big office space in my house basement where I can put a lot of bookshelves. And so I've got the room to keep reading that way and storing my books. I know people that I've got a good friend that will read paper books often and then sells them, with Amazon Marketplace, Facebook Marketplace, whatever. And so he just kind of brings it in and sometimes buys it used, reads it, and then sells it again if he doesn't have a lot of space for it. You can certainly read digitally, and there are, in the early days of Kindle and some of those things, it was much harder to underline and
right.
and highlight passages and so on. And so I didn't want to use that then, because if I'm going to read a book, I want to capture great quotes and I want to be able to reference things and go back to it later. Now they've got a lot of tools, and you can highlight the screen if you see a sentence you want to remember, and you can then download that on your computer and print it off, and so it. And there are the advantage of you can do word searches. So it's like, I remember there's a story about Churchill in that book. I'll just go search the word Churchill and it'll bring me right to it. So there's certainly some tools now that make digital reading
it's
better.
come a long way.
If you have a limited space, or if you're taking your iPad with you and you've got access to your whole library basically,
right.
Everywhere you go. So for me, when I'm writing and I'm going to go away somewhere to the beach for a week to write, I've got to basically get a duffel bag of books I'm going to be referencing or researching or reading and haul all those with me. And so it's a lot more cumbersome than grabbing your iPad.
Sure.
And so that's certainly where things are going. And then there's also just audio books.
Yeah.
And my wife and I are planning to go down to Hilton Head here in a little bit, and so I said to her, your job is to find a good audio book for us to listen to. But I'll tell you, audiobooks are for me, it's really more for light reading or things I don't think I'm going to be referencing a lot. I don't, because it
probably more fiction.
Yeah, it's a book I kind of wanted to be familiar with, but I'm probably not going to be citing somewhere. But even with fiction, the kind of writing I do, I might want to cite something from David Copperfield or Tale of Two Cities or
Sure.
classic literature. And so even when I'm reading from those kind of books, I tend to want to have a pen in my hand. And so but however you do it, the key I think is reading in a way that you can recall important stuff that you read. And especially if you're any kind of public speaker or you're a writer, if you got to get up in front of people and make presentations, then you want to just capture as many illustrations and examples and relevant statistics as you can. And so don't waste a read. When I'm reading a 900,000 page book, if you're going to read through all that, you're going to come across some great stories and illustrations, and oftentimes they're buried in the midst of this book. And and for me, it's almost like discovering gold. You're reading away in this book, and all of a sudden there's this great illustration, and it's like, wow, all the talks I've ever heard about this guy, I've never read this story about him before.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I could use in a talk somewhere. And so when I'm reading, I'm underlining sentences or words that I think are key for me to remember. Of course, there's a lot of folks that are, and probably, they're probably right and I'm wrong, but their whole thought is about resale. It's like, okay, if I sell this book later, but I don't want it all marked up because then it takes the value away. But I'm not thinking that way, which probably
I don't know. Have you ever sold one of your books, actually?
No, because if it's one that I think would be worthy of selling, then I want to keep it. If I'm willing to get rid of it, it's probably not worth that.
It's just
much.
different philosophies.
Yeah, I have given away some fluff books that most of those were ones that were given to me that I decided I didn't need and they were taking up space. But so I've got sort of a tier that I use in highlighting books. I'll underline key phrases. I may make just a little check in the margin that says, hey, there's a little more significant point here. I'll if it's a really good point, I usually put a Q, which just means quote. And so it just tells me this is a quote I need to pull out, and I'll be able to use it somewhere. And then when I get through the whole book, and this is a little tedious, especially when you're doing it the old school way instead of with a Kindle, but then I'll get a notepad and I'll go back and I'll just kind of quickly skim through, and anywhere where I see a key quote or statistic or something, I'll just put the page number and maybe not write the whole thing out, but just alert myself. Here's that great Churchill quote on whatever, and sometimes if it's a great quote, I may just write it all out because it's just so good. But I'll go through the whole book, and I mean, if it's a 1,000-page book, I may have 6-7 pages of notes summarizing it. And then I just, and a lot of times now I'll write a book review on the book and post that on my blog site. But, and so I may print that book review off as well and stick it in the book and stick my notes in the book. So later when I'm putting a talk, like I was doing a talk on leadership the other day, and I was thinking about an incident in George Washington's life where he came upon a battle and basically people were demoralized and retreating, and he rode up on his horse and waved his hat and said, follow me and we'll have the enemy in no time, kind of thing. And so I remembered that. I remembered reading the story. Of course, I don't remember. I mean, I know it's somewhere in that biography, so I pulled that off, and I know generally around the time frame. It was in the Revolutionary War, but then you pull out your book, your little notepad, and sure enough, I've got a story there. It was just kind of the beginning of that quote. And so I flip over to that page, and sure enough, there it is, And so you want to, and I'll be honest with you, I hear a lot of pastors that when they're preaching, they don't have a lot of illustrations, or they maybe are using the same stories over and over again. And what that tells me is, boy, those people need to be reading, and they need to be capturing quotes and stories. And you just need to build a reservoir of illustrations and sometimes I'll kind of highlight to say, well, this is a great quote for family. Maybe it's a story about a dad. Here he was, a famous general, but he took time to look out for his son. I remember there's a great story just about that, about Dwight Eisenhower. One time, his son was a lowly officer, like the lowest level officer in the Army you could be, and his dad, of course, is the highest level officer. So they'd be walking together. He'd be walking with his dad, and of course, everybody was saluting because Eisenhower nobody was higher than him. And the son said something about, well, this is awkward. How do we work this out? He said, where people are saluting, but I've got the officers that are higher than me saluting, but they're lower than you. And basically that's what Eisenhower said. He said, son, there's no one we're going to meet who's over me, and no one we're going to meet who's under you. And to say, but you get to hang out with him because he's your dad, So you come across a story like that, and you think, oh, how Father's Day, or sermons on leadership in the home would be. So I'll sometimes sort of tag those so that it just cues me in. If I'm giving a talk and so. Now, it's certainly digitally is going to be in the long run better. You can kind of do word searches and have a lot more tools for that. But the key is if you're any kind of communicator of any kind, verbally or written, you just owe it to your folks. And I've got lots of people, like if I give a talk and I give an example, for like that Eisenhower one or something. Yeah. I'll always have people come up afterward and say, I just love those stories from history. They'll say, I've had people say, I've read, 2 books on Churchill, but I never heard that story before. I'll say, oh, well, that's in Manchester's book, if you got that. And so there's people who love that because it not only does it make a good point, it not only does it keep your interest, but it's interesting. You learn something about history, So
well, and we know from just, I guess you say, human psychology and our makeup is that we tend to gravitate to story. We relate in story, and when you can bring story to bear on your leadership, that is a lot more memorable when you're giving speeches or if you're having to communicate to people. But and I would say not everyone that listens is a traveling public speaker like yourself, and so. But what I wanted to do with today's episode is just get your pick your brain about how you tackle these books, and certainly perhaps not everything that you do our listeners are going to replicate. I certainly don't, and perhaps I should be a bit more thorough in my note taking. But I want people to see how you read books, and I think there's a lot that can be learned. And we'll pick this up after the break. But we've got a few more ways I think that we can sort of pick your brain to understand and to become better readers in leadership positions. So let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll finish up. Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is October 26th to 28th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until September 26th, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes. Well, Richard, you've read a lot and you've written a lot in your career, and I love just seeing the way that you read, seeing how you comprehend books, how you think critically about books, the techniques that you employ. But I want to ask, when you're trying to decide on a book, how do you pick a book to read?
Yeah, great question. I try to. I think in the earlier days, I think I just took a book and just read straight through it and then got another book. Maybe as I'm getting older, I'm having a harder time focusing, but I think now I have a lot of interest, and so there's different kinds of books I want to read. So of course, I love biographies, and for me that's it's fun. For me, biographies are fun reading. But also I get lots of stories and examples and for my own material. So I usually have a biography that I'm working on. but then my subject, I mean, my area of expertise is leadership, and so typically I've got a book on leadership as well. Most of the time, I also want to be reading somewhere that is just enriching my Christian life, my devotional life. So I want to have something that's just in that devotional realm, making me just think, see things perhaps a little bit differently or deeper. Typically, I like to have at least one just real kind of, for me, fun book, which if I'm really going to be just wasteful and extravagant, it's going to be a fiction book. And for a number of years, I really didn't read much fiction just because I had so much nonfiction I was reading. But now, it might mean that I either read this. Usually now it's like a classic or something, but I just pulled out Tale of Two Cities the other day and thought, I never actually just read through this, and I really should. And so I may take that to the beach with me, or maybe read at the end of the day, or time where maybe my mind's not as sharp enough to be really capturing the tough stuff. And maybe the last category is just stuff that I may not necessarily agree with, but I want to be informed of. So it might be the writings of an atheist, or it might be the writings of someone that a church leader that has some, what I consider some heretical or off the wall ideas. But kind of one of my categories is I have a number of friends that will say to me, Richard, I've been reading this book and it's really troubling me. It's really popular. Everybody's talking about it, but I just think there's something not right about it, but I'm not sure I can put my finger on it. Could you look at it? And I just can't do that for everybody. I mean, that's partly why I have the blog site where I try to write reviews to be helpful to people. But during the COVID season, I think I've read 3 or 4 books, basically because I'm trying to help someone else out.
You probably wouldn't have otherwise read.
Yeah, but if it's influential in a negative way, I want to be informed. A lot of times people will condemn somebody, but they've never actually read the book. So like I remember several years ago, the book The Shack was wildly popular, but there were people that just totally discounted it, but they'd never read it. And I'm not saying you have to read every book that you disagree with either, but but ones that are really exerting an influence, and people will say, yeah, but that book really blessed me, or I know someone who got saved reading that book. And so there are times where I'll just read a book because it has had great influence, and I want to just be informed of what it says, and also be able to point people to where it takes the wrong turn somewhere along the way. So I try to spread it around, and sometimes it's just a matter of where I'm at. If it's at the end of the day, I kind of know I just don't have the bandwidth at this point to read real heavy, slugging kind of stuff, and so I'll look over on my desk, and I've got 5 different genres of books, and I sort of estimate, what do I have the capacity to be reading right now? And let me just go for that right now, and just so I don't waste this time, but I don't take on something that's more than I can process. And
and you're real plugged into reading, and you have a lot of people around you as well that are reading, and they're maybe recommending books. Like you work with a lot of leaders, and they say, you read this, or they'll even send you a book to that's making the rounds. For people who maybe aren't as plugged in, how would you encourage them to kind of start that journey of reading what's good now, maybe some of the classics? Maybe they don't have a circle of friends that are big readers, and they're not really sure where to even start. How would you direct someone?
Well, I've actually been pleased, Sam, how many people have that I've come across who've listened to this podcast and have picked up biographies that we highlighted. And after they heard about certain people, they thought, wow, he really sounds interesting. I'd like to read about him. And so you can listen to podcasts like this, or you can read like my blog site. I review books, and I mean, it could be a spoiler alert because I highlight a lot of the best stuff or quotes that
plot twists.
I thought, but books can be expensive and they take time, and so you don't want to get into a 1,000-page book and realize, this is not for me. And so, it doesn't hurt to read. If you know people, like if you resonate with me and like a lot of my opinions and perspectives, then more than likely we may like a lot of the same kind of books. So, so if you like, if you trust kind of where I'm coming from, then read my stuff. And I try to rate when I do a book review out of a scale of 1 to 5. And I've almost never given anything a 5, very rarely. If I do, it's like just go out and buy that immediately and read it. I've given some 4s, and then there's some I'll just give a 1 and say, I read it, I'm familiar with it now, but I wouldn't, if you've got limited time and money, I wouldn't waste it on that book. And so, that kind of, there's resources like that out there. And of course, I'm always asking people, I'm around a bunch of CEOs that are big into leadership and business leadership, and a lot of great pastors, and they'll just say, "Hey, Richard, you got to read this. It turned my world upside down. It's the best I've ever read on this subject." And so, as you know, I've got a couple of shelves in my office of just books on deck, and that have been recommended to me. And so I'll sort of try to work through those. I keep adding more to the pile, and the books keep getting sort of shoved back further or in different order, but I'm trying to, I want to be a thought leader, and for my kids, when my kids were going through their PhD studies, they'd come across some challenging books, and they'd say, "Dad, I'd really like to know what you think about this book." And there were times it really stretched me. It wasn't my field, but it was something my kids were going through, and I wanted to be able to at least have a discussion with them. And so I'll force myself to read some books that for me are not easy, and I'm having to look stuff up in the dictionary and whatever else. But so you kind of keep the range there. And
So I guess that begs the question. You've mentioned you've given some books a 1-star rating, and so when you get a book that you don't like, or you start reading a book that you just totally disagree with, should you just stop reading it? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm a little obsessive compulsive, and so
I doubt you've quit many books.
No, I haven't. There's times I've tried to speed read to get to the end. I'm a guy. Most books but I don't necessarily recommend that. I admit that that's just an issue that I need psychological help with. But no, I think you should read far enough in that you really get the gist of what this person's trying to say. And there are some books that, honestly, after you've read 2 or 3 chapters, you get their point. They have one point, and they're stretching that point over a whole book. And they've laid it out. They've given you their definition. They've given you their main argument. Now it's just a bunch of illustrations and peripheral information that's not really going to help you. That you got the point. And so, really fundamentally, I would say at that point, you can just cut your losses and say, okay, I get it. And I can put this book down. And maybe it's, for that one point, it's worth it. And that's why a lot of times when someone says, well, do you have some books you'd recommend? A lot of times I'll feel like, well, that book was really good for this point. If you just read the first chapter of that book, it's great. And then, that's all you need to read. And so it's almost like, well, I can't really recommend the whole book, but
he
but
makes
for
a
this
good point in chapter 2.
So I would encourage you, don't get bogged down. Like, as I've known, I'll tell you what, I took about 2 or 3 runs at the Brothers Karamazov. It's a classic. I felt like I should read it, but a couple times earlier in my career, I just got too busy. I had too many other books to read, and I start into it. And of course, I'm underlining stuff, and so it's a 1,000-page book to begin with, and then I'm underlining and reading carefully. And so, but I finally thought, I'm just pushing through, and I'm going to read this thing. And so I did. I finished it all. But there's some books worth doing that for, and don't get discouraged. But if you get just overwhelmed and it's just sitting there week after week and you're not reading anything, then maybe change it up. Don't get bogged down. Yeah. Maybe pick up a 110-page book that has one key refreshing point. It makes it and it exits the scene, and just read that. So you got your brain working and you're learning something new.
Yeah. So I guess as we wind down here, what books for you really got you excited about reading? Let's go way back. What really got you into
Well,
into all this?
I loved earlier on. I loved historic fiction, and when I was in high school, and even before that,
I could see that.
books that weren't real characters, but they were based in a time that was real, and
Yeah.
a war that really happened, and all the events are true to life, and so I felt like I was learning. I was just dropping into the Wild West, and this guy never actually existed, but he's a compilation of
Right.
people that did, and I remember just as a kid, it just being swept up into these worlds and these times and these places, and learning at the same time. And I remember in about the 11th grade, there was a couple of guys that were historic fiction writers, and it would always be based on a real event that took place in a world war or something, and so you'd be learning all about real spy agencies or real bombs that were really invented or whatever. But and I remember my social studies teacher, I'd come into class with those books, and he loved them too. And so he and I'd be talking away about these history, because it just made you love history.
Yeah.
And so, and then when I got into my professional career, I remember reading, I think it was John Maxwell's book, Developing the Leader Within You, which was, and also I read Oswald Saunders' book, Spiritual Leadership. And I think those two books really got me turned on to leadership. And all of a sudden I realized, like, I knew I needed to be a better leader, but when I read those books, and it just gave you a lot of just real practical things to think about, that I just realized, wow, like, if I just read books like this, I could pick up so much that would make my leadership better and more effective. And so, I read a number of, Maxwell's got so many books out there. But early on, that book, I think in particular, got me really going. And then I just began, and then I just would, I'd be reading one leadership book, and they would highly recommend some other leadership book. And so I'd order that, and I'd read it next. And I just sort of led me to eventually just kind of cover the waterfront of great leadership books. And same with biographies. I think we highlighted recently the biography by Pollock on D.L. Moody. There's a biography on Spurgeon I read. Of course, Manchester's biography on Churchill. Some of those kind of books that the writer just has a way of not just telling you what happened, but just pulling you right into their life, and where you just, you see their foibles and you see their weaknesses, but you also are just delighted with who they are as people, and they're real. But then you see the incredible things they did, and so that got me into just loving reading biographies. And so for me, there's this huge world of great stories and people to get to know. And so if you got bogged down by, I see people sometimes who tried to tackle a book, and I'll look at that book and say, oh, that is a tedious, long, boring. There's some historians who are historians in the worst sense of the word. They just they just take delight in all these dry documents and long discussions that aren't interesting. And if you happen to get one of those books, it's going to just wear you out, and you're never going to want to read again. But there are some books that just grip you and engage you and are well written and keep you on the edge of your seat. And get a couple of those books and read those, and you'll be hooked. And you'll just keep looking for, and there's some authors that are just always good. So whenever you see, oh, so-and-so's got a new book out, I'll get it. I know it'll be good. That's also a great way. But get started, because it's, there's so much that you could be refreshed, and your thinking could be expanded and enriched, and it's just going to be a blessing to everybody around you as you grow and as you learn.
So I imagine someone like you doesn't have a favorite.
No, it's like saying, what's your favorite child?
Yeah.
It's like, there's so many different genres. If you're talking about a leadership book, well, there's several that maybe would be in my top biographies. There's some fiction. It's, so in different seasons.
I won't make you.
I'd feel like
one.
I'd be hurting the feelings of all my other books if I were to do that.
Well, this has really been a treat, and it's been delightful to just see just the benefits and the power of reading. And something that I was thinking about as you were talking is just this act of writing a book review.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more leaders, church leaders, pastors, maybe you don't want to publish a book review. But I think there's something extremely powerful about at least emailing a book review of a book that you're reading to your staff and saying, hey, I've read this book. This is what I think about it.
Yeah.
I think that can be so just powerful in the life of those that you lead. And it's a window into how you think. It's a window in just an opening in how you can relate to your boss. And so I think I would really encourage those in leadership, whether it's in the church or in business, at the very least, just to start, summarizing some books and getting those out to your people.
I think, just anytime you read a book, before you just put it on your shelf or you put it up for sale, you should just ask yourself, so what are my takeaways?
Yeah.
What were the takeaways here? Is there one quote that is just worth the read of the book, or is there 3 things I learned that are real helpful, and I could summarize all that? And so someone asked me later, hey, someone recommended this book. What do you think? Well, here's the 3 things I got from that book. And maybe a person doesn't even need to read it all. They can, really get a lot from your book review. But
yeah.
And I know some guys who just do book reviews and if you want to get it, I'll be glad to let you know what I'm reading. You can glance over it, maybe grab a great quote out of it and move on.
Yeah.
So, there's lots you can do with that.
Well, this has been great, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.